What's going on, YouTube? We're back with another video, and today I'm actually not working on that Integra or my CRV. We are working on a friend of mine's Integra. Stock LS. Probably do about 10 pounds. eBay kit, make like 250. But it should be a pretty good process. With this specific turbo kit, it's not AC friendly, so we've already drained the refrigerant out of the AC system. You can have a local mechanic do it, or using a few machines, you can do it at home if you have access to it. I believe that you're able to retain the factory power steering system with this turbo kit, so we're going to make sure that that's true when we bolt everything up. In which case, if we're not able to retain it, then we'll be deleting that as well, but we're hoping to keep that. And we're gonna start the process off by jacking the car up so we have a little bit more room to work underneath as well as on top, and remove the front bumper. It's pretty simple to remove these front bumpers. Normally there are clips right here, and this one has the factory one, so you're just gonna turn your wheel sideways, and there's a little Phillips head right there. And then there'll be sometimes, all over here, you have the bolts that you need to take off, and then corner bolts right there as well. And the front face should be able to come right off as long as he doesn't have the splash guard underneath. Most cars do not of this year, of this era, I guess you could say. A lot of them come off over time. But if it does, it should just be Phillips heads or 10mm bolts at the bottom as well. Okay, now that we've removed the front bumper and all the corresponding bolts for it, so you don't lay them all aside, we can start the tear down of the engine components, starting with the hoses for the AC. Then we're going to take the heat shield off and unbolt the exhaust manifold. The most thing you're going to need right now is like 10mm bolts and 12mm sockets, And then for the AC compressor, I believe it's a couple 14s. So I think I'm going to set my phone down real quick and just start unbolting this. Something to note, the stock radiator shroud is kind of sharp, so careful not to cut yourself. Now that we have the heat shield exposed, we're going to there. Some have bolts, some have studs. In this case, these are all studs with nuts. What I like about these are that they are the locking ones, so make sure to keep those and we'll be able to use them again. Now that we have all the nuts taken off up top, we're gonna come underneath. And here is where the exhaust runs. There are 2 bolts, one right here and one right here that you're gonna be taking off as well. And there is a little support bracket off of the block to the exhaust. We're going to be removing those bolts as well, and then drop this whole unit all together. That way we are able to free up the exhaust system from the engine itself. The header removed. Another thing to note is that there is an O2 sensor there. Just one simple clip that comes off of the wiring harness, and that comes down. Moving over to this portion, here is the AC compressor itself. As you can see now that the exhaust manifold is taken off, there's 12mm bolts right here on each 4-corner, another right there, and 2 on the bottom in the same corresponding place that hold the compressor onto the bracket itself. So we are going to take off the belt, which is as simple as loosening the tensioner bolt right here, and then the tensioner bolt, it's a 12 if I'm not mistaken, a 12 or a 14, and the belt comes right off. And we can take the compressor off, as well as the bracket that looks like it's being held on by 14mm bolts. So we have the AC compressor taken off, but I'm leaving the bracket on, up to the discretion of the owner, depending on what you want to do, because that also has a torque mount that's attached to this side over here. It helps with the flex of the engine. Next thing we're doing is removing this AC hose. Eventually we'll remove the whole AC system to have a cleaner finish, but right now we're just taking off what's essential. Taking off this big nut right here that connects the hoses, as well as a bolt that connects this at the bottom, and this is coming off. That way we can put the manifold on and test fit a few things before we do the final installation. Now that the manifold is in place, not bolted down or anything obviously, we can verify that it will keep power steering, no problem. Here's the wastegate placement that we're gonna have. If we decide to go this route, it's gonna be up to the fabricator, since I don't weld, unfortunately not yet. He wants to do up pipes on the whole car, so this is kind of a tight bend, and that would be up to the fabricator's discretion. Another way that would be a lot easier would just to be placing it that way and have it go straight down the dump for the wastegate. Now that that's already test fitted, we're going to take this off and start removing a little bit more of the AC components. I believe I'm going to take off the condenser now, free up a little bit of space in the front for the intercooler, and start mocking those things up. We are removing the condenser, setting this off to the side. Reason being that we don't just leave it in there and skip that step like some people do is because now, one, it's going to be useless, and two, it's going to block airflow that could be better used. Easy way to remove the condenser is just remove the two lines that get held by a 10 millimeter bolt in the front, that one and this one as well. Then remove the brackets for the radiator, push the radiator forward, and pull it out from the top. Now what we're going to continue to do is start to remove these unnecessary lines from the side. All the other parts that we don't need, like this stuff right here, we're just going to go ahead and remove and make a cleaner engine bay as well. So far, since the last clip, I was able to remove a stock airbox that baffles everything right here and then feeds into the stock intake manifold. That way we cleared up a lot of space right here. It's that big old useless thing right there. We can run our piping correctly. Now I removed the battery and I'm taking out the tray that's held by 12 millimeter bolts. That way we can finish removing these lines. We're not going to go as far as removing the dash and removing the things inside underneath the dash, but if you want, there's a few other videos online that show you how to do that exactly. So we just got over to our local parts store, AutoZone. Reason being, I'm going to pick up some high temperature hose for the fittings for the oil return. Now normally I recommend AN fittings, which if you're not aware of that, it's basically a thread-on fitting that seals with the flare. Instead of this method, although this method is fine for regular cars as well, this, instead of being welded onto the oil pan, is drilled through the oil pan, and then using crush washers, it seals, and then this would be the bottom on your oil pan in return, and this off of the turbo. So now we're just going to pick up some high temp hose to go along with this as well. Ended up going to Napa to get the hose. He said that this is a hydraulic high temperature hose and that it should work perfectly for this. Normally the one that I order, if I'm doing it with a lot of time ahead of time, there's a blue one online that's specifically for it, but he said this should be more than enough. Now that we're back, we have the hose clamped on as well as the gasket for the return. Something to take note, since this is a bottom mount turbo manifold, which means that the manifold is on top and the turbo itself is on the bottom, we're going to have to switch the way that this is sitting. Right now, think of the manifold sitting right here, and this is the return, the one with the big square. And the feed is the one that's looks like it threads on, because there's a few different ways to put the feed on. But what we have to do is loosen these, I believe they're 13 millimeter bolts, take them all out, or at least loosen them so the turbo can spin. And we're going to clock it the opposite way with this facing down. All right, now we have the turbo attached to the manifold as well as the wastegate. I also have the oil lines placed onto the turbo that not completely tight yet, but they have the corresponding gaskets. That way we can make sure that everything is clocked correctly once we put it on the car, which I'm going to go ahead and mount right now. Okay, I have it briefly mounted up right there. As you can see, there's no nuts onto the studs yet. I just want to make sure everything is how it should before we do final install. I have the line for the feed going towards the back of the engine, and then later I'll show you exactly where we're connecting this to. I personally prefer to use the sandwich plate method, which what it does is basically a spacer behind the oil filter, and then it runs the feed off of there. Unfortunately, it was not supplied in this kit. So what it does have, and I believe is what we're going to use, is this little T-looking thing, although there's 4 ports, and it comes with one little block off, which will tap into the stock oil pressure sending unit and be able to supply oil pressure from there. That's pretty much it for that. If you look, we have the oil return with more than enough lines. They just sold me all this in one increment. This we are going to cut and put it to the correct location on the oil pan. Right now I can't really get a good angle, but the oil pan is coming off. That way we can drill the oil pan and put the fitting on. And if you guys aren't familiar with how to remove your oil pan, I do have another video that I'll try to link in the description on my channel on how to remove and replace the oil pan with its corresponding gasket. And in this case, I'll just show you exactly where drilling it to add on to that video. Over here, we have the cold side of the turbo clocked this way. It's not very easy to fit a filter right there, but you can do extra piping right here, like a coupler to go around it, and then have your filter sit somewhere over here, or have it run over to this side, like the stock filter location. Totally up to you. The down pipe or up pipe, depending on how he wants to have the fabricator do it, which looks like a down pipe would probably be your best option on this, would be fabricated down over there where the stock AC compressor normally sits. Off of the design of this manifold, one of the runners, this one right here, hits the manifold, or the stud that comes off the manifold. So we are removing the stud right now. It's pretty easy to do. You just lock 2 nuts onto the stud itself. That way you can unthread it from the head. And it's kind of hard with one hand right now, but instead of using a stud on there, we're gonna try to fit a bolt. And if by any means it does not fit, it's not such a big deal to have 1 out of, I think, the 9 or 10 that's there missing, because you have the clamping force all around it. And it's normally what happens with these cheap manifolds. You don't really see that when you have the more expensive, high quality ones. But on these eBay kits, sometimes little stuff like that doesn't always function how it should, and you have to do these types of modifications. All right, now we have the oil pan itself drilled out. I've already washed it, cleaned it, and it's ready to go back with no debris or anything. So I'm gonna put 1 washer onto this piece right here. That goes right over top. And on the back, I'll put the other washer. And the nut right behind it. Now I've tightened both sides with some adjustable wrenches. And let's see how this holds up. I mean, it's what was supplied with the kit, so hopefully it does its job. So now we're just gonna wait for the bottom right here to dry up and we can reinstall the pan. Like I mentioned earlier, there's another video that I have on how to change the pan gasket and the pan itself. All right, just a little update clip. I think the last one that I recorded was of drilling and putting the drain onto the pan. So that's all in there with the new gasket, as well with everything sealing with the RTV in the 4 corners where it should be. And I started putting the intercooler piping on. And as you can see, on this side, it's perfect as it should be. That kit on that portion of it seems to be okay. The down pipe, I was able to find a pipe laying around before we take it to the fabricator, so we can at least start it and drive it over back to the customer's house. Then for the mount on the intercooler, it has these little, I'm not sure what they're called, spacers or something welded onto the intercooler itself. So I was able to drill out the stock crash bar and put a couple bolts along with lock washers in there, so it's holding it nice and firm. That's not going anywhere. But the problem that I'm running into right now is that, among other things, this kit was somewhat of a universal, just happens to come with a B series turbo manifold. So the piping itself does not fit exactly how we need it. There's like 3 extra pipes, and then 1 pipe that doesn't flow how it should for the blow-off valve placement. This bend is wrong, as well as this. If you look at my car, I think I still have the piping in there. Waiting on tranny upgrades right now. But if you look at my car, the piping comes down and then has another bend at the bottom. Blow-off valve sits right there. Some of them sit over there. But it's a lot more of a 90 and then 90 downwards to fit the OEM piping style, so you don't have to cut and fabricate. So I think I'm gonna try to figure this out real quick. I'll probably end up cutting a few pieces since it did come with extra clamps and extra couplers. I'll probably just custom make some piping with the extra couplers. Okay, so we ended up having to skip to the next day because last night it started raining a lot, so I wasn't able to finish it in the garage. I put my car back in. I just wanted to show you real quick what I'm gonna do next. I have to hook up the oil line for the feed, and I want to show you on the back of this engine, which is the same engine that's in the interior out there, exactly how I'm going to do so. So there are a few different methods on how to receive oil to the turbo, or in other cases to the VTEC head for people who do LS VTEC. The method that we're going to use is adapting off of the stock sending unit for the oil pressure. So this sensor right here normally goes threaded into the back of the block right here next to the oil filter. And what this is going to do, it's going to still provide the oil pressure to the sensor itself and have an extra port up top so we can supply oil to the turbo. There's another method to do this, which is using a sandwich plate, which basically does a spacer right here and supplies oil from there, which I personally prefer, but the customer in this case has this and he wants to try this out. Something to keep in mind, it's always important to, when using these MPT fittings or MSBT, like any type of pipe thread, you want to make sure that you have the correct thread tape, which you can get this at like Lowe's or something, which basically just stops the fitting from leaking itself. So we're at the car itself right now. I'm not going to record putting it on the car since I just described how you do it on a spare engine over there. So essentially what we're going to do is attach this part to the motor itself, and this fitting is going to thread up top. This is going to sit on the back of the engine like this and supply the necessary oil from here to the actual turbo itself, and that should be all good. Besides that, I have to put the radiator fan back on because I was trimming the shroud a little bit to fit the turbo better, and the car should be ready to fire up after that. I mentioned it earlier, he's not getting tuned yet. He's waiting on injectors and an ECU to tune, so I'm going to leave the not stock, but the aftermarket intake that he had right over here while he orders the correct piping, and we'll just let it run like this, spinning the turbo but not producing any positive pressure. That way he can drive it normal to work or around town, no problem. And then once he gets the correct parts for injectors and ECU, I'll be able to put the right charge pipe in there and we can actually get a dyno tuned. So I have the stock sensor right there with the T and the oil feed going out there. Now I'm going to put the new oil filter and reconnect the stock sensor. All right, like I said, we are going to keep the charge piping off for now since it is stock tuned. And right now we are going to crank the car over, although I disconnected the distributor, because anytime that you do a big oil thing or something that you're getting rid of most of the oil in the car, you want to crank it over first and have good oil pressure before you start it. That should be enough. Now I'm going to go ahead and plug that back in and then start the car. Well, not super loud, but louder than stock. Now is a good time to look underneath, go over all your oil, especially your oil lines, especially, more important than everything else, just to make sure you don't have any leaks. And as you can see, the manifold starts to smoke a little bit. That's normal because you have a little bit of oil on the new parts, as well as the cheaper manifolds tend to churn color once they go through a heat cycle. So don't be worried about that. Completely normal. Another important thing to remember is that, like I said earlier, we have been messing with the oil system in the car. Regular oil change takes about 4.5 quarts for these engines. In this case, we had to add about 5 quarts for 2 reasons. When you do a normal oil change, you have residual oil that always stays in the oil pan that almost never gets drained out. Just gets filtered out throughout the time that it's in the engine. And another reason, now we have extra oil lines, being the feed for the turbo and the return for the turbo. So you have more space for where the oil needs to be. So we filled it up to 4.5 quarts, which is the correct measurement. We checked the dipstick and it was at the full. We started it, we let it idle for a little bit. We checked the oil again, and it was right at the half mark, which indicates, and I'm dropping the dipstick everywhere. It was right between those 2 dots, which indicates needing about 1/2 quart. Don't be worried about that. It's very normal to have to add a little bit more. That's why whenever you do anything like modification-wise, it's always good to start the car, make sure it idles correctly, turn it off, let the oil settle down into the pan again, and then recheck and add as needed. So in this case, it took the whole 5 quarts. Another quick little tip, since we did change the oil pan gasket, there's 4 places that you have to put RTV or Honda Bond or Permatex, whatever you decide to use, which is between the where the block connects to the oil pump and the rear main seal, or the housing for the rear main seal. You have to put a little dab of Honda Bond. I like to wait for it to fully cure before adding oil. So for example, what I did yesterday, when I started the process, I removed the oil pan and I put the Honda Bond as well as the gasket and put it back on as one of the first things. That way it starts drying and the process of the cure begins. I just now added the oil, the very last thing, because I wanted to give it as much time to dry as possible. What's left for the car right now is basically put the stock bumper back on, as well as the support brackets and everything that we took off. And just like anything, it's just reversing the process. One thing that you have to keep in mind is that this is an aftermarket component. Just like anything aftermarket, things will not fit as OEM. For example, the stock splash guard that goes on the bottom, we had to either modify or remove so we can fit the intercooler piping. And then it fits a lot easier if the splash guard right here for the fender well is cut as well. He's actually pretty slammed, so he should be getting rid of that as well, or at least modifying it so he can fit his tires to how he desires. But it's just one thing to keep in mind. Don't be afraid if you have to modify a few things, because that's just part of the game, basically. But that pretty much sums it up for today. That's the end of the video. You know, I had to put the SP tuning sticker on there. If you guys aren't already subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe and notification. We are doing a lot more things, not only with simple builds like this, but if you don't know the channel already, that's my Integra right there that I should probably pull in because it started to drizzle. I have something over the up pipes, so don't worry about that. But that's my 659 horsepower Integra set up for drag racing. I just got new slicks and new wheels for it, so we are going to have some fun in this coming week. Make sure to leave a comment down below to let me know what you thought about it. If you have any tips or tricks you want to share with everybody else, let us know down below as well. And like always, have a good one and stay tuned for more.